From the war, he nodded, setting his shovel aside and rolling his shoulder with obvious discomfort. Took some shrapnel at Antietam. Army surgeon did what he could, but some things don't heal quite right. Sarah had been curious about Ezra's military service since she'd first seen his old blanket, but he rarely spoke of those years. Now, watching him struggle with pain he was clearly accustomed to hiding, she found her curiosity growing stronger. "Were you an officer?" Sergeant led a squad of good men who deserved better than what that war raised them. Ezra's voice carried the weight of old grief, losses that time had softened but never fully healed. That evening, as they sat by the fire after a day of digging out from the storm, Sarah's attention was drawn to a small wooden box on the mantelpiece that she had noticed but never asked about. When Ezra saw her looking at it, he rose and retrieved the box, handling it with the careful reverence reserved for sacred things. "You want to know about the war," he said, settling back into his chair with the box in his lap. "I suppose you have a right." He opened the box slowly, revealing its contents to the firelight. Sarah saw a tarnished silver medal attached to a faded ribbon, along with a folded piece of paper that looked official and important. "Medal of Honor," Ezra said quietly, lifting the decoration from its resting place. "Got it for pulling 6 wounded men out of Confederate fire during the Battle of Fredericksburg. Spent 14 hours crawling back and forth across that battlefield, dragging boys who were dying too young and too far from home." Sarah stared at the medal, understanding instinctively that she was looking at something extraordinary. "You're a hero. I'm a man who did what needed doing." Ezra's tone suggested that the distinction mattered to him. "Heroes are what other people call you when they weren't there to see how scared you were. But you saved those men, saved 6, lost 12. He refolded the citation carefully and placed it back in the box alongside the medal. "The ones I couldn't reach, the ones who died while I was helping someone else. Those are the ones that follow you home." Sarah began to understand the shadows she sometimes saw in Ezra's eyes, the moments when his attention seemed to drift to places and times far from their mountain sanctuary. "Is that why you came here? To get away from the memories?" "Partly. After Mary died, the memories got louder, harder to ignore." Ezra closed the box and held it against his chest. "She had a way of keeping the ghosts quiet, of reminding me that there was more to life than what I'd lost. And now—" Ezra looked at her across the firelight, and Sarah saw something in his expression that made her heart race. "Now I'm starting to remember that again." The admission hung between them like a bridge. Neither was quite ready to cross. Sarah felt the weight of it, the implications of caring for someone who had already lost so much, and the dangerous hope that maybe, just maybe, they could heal together. "The men you saved," she said finally, "do you ever wonder what happened to them? I know what happened to some of them. They went home, got married, had children, lived the lives they might not have had if someone hadn't pulled them off that battlefield." Ezra's voice grew stronger, more certain. "That's worth something, even if it doesn't balance the scales. It's worth everything. Mary used to say that. Said every life saved was a victory against all the darkness in the world." Sarah reached across the space between their chairs and placed her hand over Ezra's, where it rested on the wooden box. She was right. The touch was brief, tentative, but it carried the weight of understanding and acceptance that had been growing between them since that first night under the stars. Spring arrived in the mountains with the tentative grace of a shy child, bringing longer days and the musical sound of snowmelt running down from the higher peaks. Sarah had survived her first mountain winter, and the experience had changed her in ways she was only beginning to understand. Her hands were stronger now, calloused from months of honest work, and her body had adapted to the rhythms of a life lived in harmony with the seasons. She was cleaning out Mary's old garden space when she found the small paper packet tucked behind a loose board in the tool shed. The packet was wrapped in oiled cloth and tied with a faded blue ribbon, clearly placed there with care and intention. When Sarah unfolded the cloth, she discovered dozens of flower seeds, each variety carefully labeled in Mary's familiar handwriting. Morning glories, sweet peas, marigolds, cosmos. And at the bottom of the packet, a note written in the same careful script. For the garden's future beauty, when someone with gentle hands comes to tend what I have started. Sarah stared at the packet of seeds, feeling tears she couldn't quite explain burning behind her eyes. Mary had left these here, knowing she would never see them bloom, trusting that someday someone would find them and continue the work of bringing beauty to this mountain sanctuary. Find something interesting. Ezra's voice came from behind her, warm with curiosity rather than concern. Sarah turned, holding up the packet so he could see it. Mary's flower seeds. She left them for whoever came after her. Ezra's expression went through a series of changes: surprise, recognition, and finally a deep sadness mixed with something that looked like wonder. She always said the garden needed flowers, not just vegetables. Called them food for the soul. Should I plant them? The question seemed to cost Ezra something to answer. Sarah could see him wrestling with emotions she couldn't fully understand. The complicated grief of a man trying to honor his past, while allowing himself to hope for a future. She would want them planted, he said finally. Mary never could stand to see potential wasted. They worked together that afternoon, preparing the flower beds that Mary had planned, but never completed. Ezra showed Sarah how to work the mountain soil, adding compost and carefully breaking up the hard, packed earth that had spent the winter under 3 feet of snow. She drew pictures, Sarah said, consulting the notes that had accompanied the seeds. Look, she planned exactly where each type should go for the best effect. The diagrams were detailed and thoughtful, showing how the different flowers would complement each other in color and height, creating a garden that would bloom in succession throughout the growing season. Sarah found herself marveling at the woman's foresight and planning, the way she had thought not just about individual plants, but about the garden as a complete work of art. Morning glories by the fence to climb, Sarah read aloud. Sweet peas in the partial shade, marigolds scattered throughout to keep the pests away from the vegetables. As they worked, Sarah became aware of Ezra watching her with an intensity that made her hands tremble slightly as she scattered seeds according to Mary's careful instructions. When she looked up and caught his gaze, she saw something in his eyes that made her breath catch. "What?" she asked softly. "You look like you belong here," he said, his voice rough with emotion. "Working in her garden, following her plans. Like this was always meant to be." Sarah felt heat rise in her cheeks, but she didn't look away. Maybe it was. The words hung between them, carrying implications that neither was quite ready to voice. Sarah had been living in Mary's clothes, sleeping in Mary's bed, and now she was planting Mary's flowers. But somewhere along the way it had stopped feeling like she was filling a dead woman's place and started feeling like she was creating her own. "These seeds," she said, returning her attention to the packet in her hands. "They're like hope, aren't they?" Mary planted them even though she knew she might not see them grow. "That's what hope is," Ezra agreed. "Planting something beautiful because you believe in tomorrow, even when today is uncertain." Sarah carefully scattered the last of the morning glory seeds along the fence line, imagining the cascade of blue and purple blooms that would eventually climb toward the sky. "I want to see them bloom," she said. "I want to be here when they do." "So do I," Ezra replied, and Sarah knew he wasn't just talking about the flowers. The sound of hoofbeats on the mountain trail came just after dawn, when Sarah was hanging laundry on the line behind the cabin and Ezra was splitting wood for the day's fire. The rhythm was wrong, too urgent, too purposeful for a casual traveler. Ezra straightened immediately, his hand moving instinctively to the rifle he kept propped against the chopping block. "Sarah," he called quietly. "Come inside." She had learned to trust his instincts about danger, developed through years of military service and mountain living. Without question, she gathered the wet clothes and moved quickly toward the cabin, noting the way Ezra positioned himself between her and the approaching rider. The man who emerged from the tree line rode a lathered horse that showed signs of hard travel. He was lean and weathered, with the kind of eyes that missed nothing and the easy confidence of someone accustomed to violence. When he saw Ezra standing ready with his rifle, the stranger raised one hand in a gesture that might have been peace or might have been something else entirely. "Easy there, soldier," the man called out, his voice carrying a slight drawl that spoke of southern origins. "Name's Jake Morris. I'm looking for Ezra Kane." "You found him." Ezra's voice was steady, but Sarah could see the tension in his shoulders. "State your business." Morrison dismounted slowly, keeping his hands visible as he reached into his coat. When his hand emerged, it held a folded paper that he extended toward Ezra. "Got a warrant here. Says you're wanted for desertion. Army's been looking for you for a long time." Sarah felt the world tilt around her as Ezra accepted the paper and unfolded it. Even from her position by the cabin door, she could see the official seals and formal language that transformed her protector into a hunted man. "Bounty's $500, Morrison continued conversationally. "Dead or alive, though I prefer alive when possible. Less paperwork." Ezra studied the wanted poster, his face revealing nothing of whatever thoughts were racing through his mind. Sarah found herself staring at the document that threatened to destroy everything they had built together, the official condemnation that reduced Ezra's heroism to a simple charge of abandoning his post. "This is dated 2 years after the war ended," Ezra observed, his voice carefully neutral. "Army don't forget, especially when a decorated soldier goes missing right before a major engagement." Morrison's tone suggested he had delivered this news many times before. "Says here you failed to report for duty at Second Bull Run. Left your men when they needed you most." Sarah saw something flicker in Ezra's eyes, pain that went deeper than physical wounds, the kind of hurt that came from having your honor questioned by people who hadn't been there to see the truth. "That's not what happened," Sarah said, stepping forward despite Ezra's warning gesture. Morrison turned his attention to her for the first time, his gaze taking in her protective stance and the way she positioned herself beside Ezra, rather than behind him. "And you would be? Someone who knows the truth about what kind of man he is." The bounty hunter's smile held no warmth. "Truth is what the Army says it is, miss. And the Army says Ezra Kane is a deserter who needs to face military justice." Ezra folded the wanted poster carefully and handed it back to Morrison. "I won't run from this, but I won't go quietly either. This charge is based on lies lolled by a commanding officer who had his own reasons for wanting me discredited." "That's between you and the tribunal," Morrison said, tucking the poster back into his coat. "My job is just to bring you in." Sarah watched the exchange with growing desperation, seeing her entire world threatening to collapse around her. The man who had saved her from a life of misery, who had treated her with kindness and respect, who had taught her what it meant to feel safe and valued, was about to be taken away by official lies and the cold machinery of military justice. "How long do I have?" Ezra asked. "I'm a reasonable man," Morrison replied. "Sun's getting high, and my horse needs rest. I'll give you until tomorrow morning to get your affairs in order." Sarah felt tears burning behind her eyes as she watched Morrison lead his horse toward the stable, making himself at home with the casual confidence of a man who held all the cards. The wanted poster might as well have been a death sentence, and they all knew it that evening. As Morrison slept in the stable and Sarah paced the cabin like a caged animal, Ezra sat at the kitchen table with a wooden box she had never seen before. His movements were deliberate and careful as he opened it, revealing documents that had been preserved with the same meticulous care he applied to everything in his life. "There's something you need to understand about that warrant," he said quietly, spreading the papers across the table where the lamplight could illuminate them properly. Sarah moved closer, her heart racing with hope that maybe, somehow, there was a way out of this nightmare. The documents were official military correspondence, some bearing seals and signatures that spoke of high authority within the Union Army. "These are my discharge papers," Ezra explained, pointing to a document dated 6 months after Second Bull Run. "Honorable discharge, signed by General McClellan himself. You don't get papers like these if you're a deserter." Sarah studied the formal language and official stamps, feeling a surge of relief that made her knees weak. Then Morrison's warrant is wrong. You can prove you're innocent. It's more complicated than that. Ezra's expression remained grim as he pulled out another document, this one bearing a different signature. This is the report filed by Captain William Hartley, my commanding officer at the time. According to him, I abandoned my post without orders and left my squad to face Confederate forces alone. But that's not true. No, it's not. Ezra's voice carried the weight of old anger, carefully controlled but still burning. The truth is that Hartley ordered me to take my squad on a suicide mission, a direct assault on entrenched Confederate positions with no artillery support and no hope of success. When I questioned the order, he accused me of cowardice. Sarah felt her hands clench into fists as she imagined the scene Ezra described. So what did you do? What any good sergeant does. I found another way. Ezra pulled out a third document, this one handwritten in faded ink. This is a letter from Lieutenant Colonel James Morrison, Jake's older brother. As it turns out, he was there that day, saw what really happened. Sarah's eyes widened as she made the connection. Morrison is here for personal reasons, not just the bounty. James Morrison died at Gettysburg 6 months later. But before he died, he wrote this letter documenting what really happened at Second Bull Run. Ezra's finger traced the lines of careful script. According to his account, I didn't abandon my post. I led my squad on a flanking maneuver that saved 37 Union soldiers from Hartley's disastrous frontal assault. The letter was detailed and specific, describing how Ezra had used his knowledge of the terrain to find a route that allowed his men to attack the Confederate position from an unexpected angle, creating the distraction needed for the rest of the Union forces to withdraw safely. Captain Hartley was furious, Ezra continued. His plan had failed, and I had made him look incompetent in front of his superiors. When he filed his report, he claimed I had disobeyed orders and endangered the mission. But you saved lives. That doesn't matter to men like Hartley. What mattered was that I had made him look bad, and he never forgot it. Ezra carefully refolded the letter and placed it back in the box. The problem is, James Morrison is dead, and his testimony can't stand against an official report filed by a superior officer. Sarah stared at the documents spread across the table, understanding dawning slowly. Jake Morrison doesn't know about his brother's letter. No reason he would. James never had a chance to submit it through official channels before he was killed. Then we have to show him. We have to make him understand that you're innocent. Ezra's smile was sad and weary. Jake Morrison's been hunting men for bounty for 10 years. You think he's going to let a dead man's letter stand between him and $500? He might if we can prove his brother believed in your innocence. And if he doesn't? Sarah looked at the man who had saved her from a life of misery and despair, who had treated her with kindness when he could have demanded anything, who had shown her what it meant to be valued and protected. Then Ezra reached across the table and took her hand, his touch warm and steady despite the uncertainty that surrounded them. Sarah, if this goes badly tomorrow, I want you to know. Don't, she squeezed his hand tightly. Don't say goodbye. We're going to find a way through this. Morning came too soon, bringing with it the sound of Morrison preparing his horse and checking his weapons with the methodical efficiency of a professional hunter. Sarah had barely slept, spending the night alternating between fierce determination to protect Ezra and cold terror at the thought of losing him to military justice built on lies. She was making coffee when Morrison knocked on the cabin door, his presence as unwelcome as a storm cloud on a clear day. When Ezra opened the door, the bounty hunter stepped inside without invitation, his eyes taking in the domestic scene with obvious amusement. "Cozy little setup you got here, Kane," Morrison said, accepting the cup of coffee Sarah offered with grudging politeness. "Almost seems ashamed to break it up." "Before you take him," Sarah said, her voice steadier than she felt, "there's something you should know about your brother." Morrison's hand stilled on his coffee cup, his casual demeanor shifting to sharp attention. "What about James?" Sarah moved to the kitchen table where Ezra had left the wooden box, her heart racing as she opened it and withdrew the letter that could change everything. He wrote this before he died, about what really happened at Second Bull Run. The bounty hunter's expression went through a series of changes as she handed him the letter: suspicion, recognition of the handwriting, and finally a deep stillness that suggested he was reading words from beyond the grave. James wrote this. Morrison's voice had lost its casual confidence, replaced by something raw and uncertain. Read it, Sarah urged. Morrison moved the window where the morning light was strongest, his eyes scanning the faded ink that contained his brother's final testimony about Ezra's actions that day. Sarah watched his face as he read, seeing the moment when understanding dawned and the official story began to crumble under the weight of truth. "He says you saved 37 men," Morrison said finally, his voice barely above a whisper. "Your brother was there. He saw what happened." Ezra's tone held no triumph, only the quiet dignity of a man stating facts. "Captain Hartley wanted those men to die for his glory. I couldn't let that happen." Morrison read the letter again, more slowly this time, as if trying to reconcile the words with everything he thought he knew about the case that had brought him to this mountain cabin. "James always said you were the best sergeant he ever served under," Morrison admitted, lowering the letter. "Said you had a gift for keeping men alive when other officers were getting them killed." Sarah felt hope blooming in her chest, but she could see that Morrison was wrestling with something deeper than just the facts of the case. The bounty on Ezra's head represented more than money. It was connected to family honor and a brother's memory. "There's more," she said, returning to the box and withdrawing another document. "Debt records from Murphy's Saloon." Morrison looked puzzled as Sarah unfolded the papers she had discovered that morning while searching through Ezra's private documents. The records showed a devastating picture of her father's gambling debts, amounts that far exceeded what any working man could hope to repay. "Your father owed money to some very dangerous people," Morrison said, scanning the figures. "More than he could pay in 10 lifetimes. That's why he sold me," Sarah said, the words coming easier now that she understood the full scope of her father's desperation. It wasn't just for beer. He was trying to keep criminals from collecting their debt in blood. Morrison's eyes sharpened as he made connections Sarah had hoped he would make. "The Kellerman gang. They've been operating in this territory for 2 years, using debt collection as cover for human trafficking. They would have taken me whether my father cooperated or not," Sarah continued. "Ezra didn't buy me. He rescued me from something far worse than anything my father could have imagined." The bounty hunter set down his coffee cup and walked to the window, staring out at the peaceful mountain landscape while his mind worked through the implications of what he had learned. Sarah could see him struggling between duty and conscience, between the letter of the law and the spirit of justice. $500 is a lot of money," he said finally. "Your brother's honor is worth more," Ezra replied quietly. Morrison turned from the window, his face showing the weight of a decision that would change everything. "James always said the best soldiers were the ones who knew when to follow orders and when to follow their conscience." Sarah held her breath, knowing that the next words out of Morrison's mouth would determine whether she and Ezra had a future together or whether this mountain sanctuary would become just another memory of something beautiful that couldn't last. Morrison's internal struggle lasted only moments before it was interrupted by the sound of approaching horses. Multiple riders, moving fast and with purpose, up the mountain trail. Sarah felt her blood turn to ice as she recognized the sound. This wasn't a casual visit or a chance encounter. "Kellerman," Morrison said grimly, his hand moving instinctively to his weapon. "Should have known they'd track me here eventually." Ezra was already moving, reaching for the rifle he kept mounted above the fireplace. The weapon was well maintained and familiar in his hands, a tool he had hoped never to need again but had never forgotten how to use. "How many?" he asked Morrison, all pretense of their adversarial relationship forgotten in the face of a greater threat. "6. Maybe 7. They've been following me for 2 days, waiting for me to lead them to something valuable." Morrison's professional demeanor had returned, but now it was focused on the real danger approaching their sanctuary. Sarah understood with terrible clarity that her father's debts had followed her, even here, to this place where she had found safety and love. The criminals who had been denied their prize were coming to collect what they believed they were owed. "They want me," she said, moving toward the back of the cabin, where Ezra kept additional weapons. They want all of us now, Ezra corrected, checking his rifle's action with movements made automatic by years of military training. We know too much about their operation. The sound of horses grew closer, and through the front window, Sarah could see the first riders emerging from the tree line. Rough men with hard faces and the kind of weapons that spoke of serious criminal intent. These weren't frontier drifters looking for easy money. They were professional predators who had built their lives on violence and intimidation. "Back door," Morrison asked, positioning himself at the side window where he could cover the cabin's eastern approach, blocked by the stable. "We're better off making our stand here." Ezra's voice carried the calm authority of a man who had faced overwhelming odds before and survived through careful planning and steady nerves. Sarah found herself remembering all the times Ezra had spoken about preparedness, about thinking through contingencies and never being caught without options. Now she understood that those lessons hadn't been about mountain weather or winter supplies. They had been about moments exactly like this one. "Sarah," Ezra said, handing her a smaller rifle that was clearly designed for someone of her size and strength. "Remember what I taught you about shooting. Breathe steady, squeeze gentle, and don't hesitate if someone threatens what we've built here." The rifle felt heavy in her hands, but not unfamiliar. Ezra had insisted on teaching her to shoot during the long winter months, claiming it was a necessary skill for mountain living. Now she realized he had been preparing her for this possibility all along. "Kane," a voice called from outside, rough and commanding. "We know you're in there. Send out the girl and we'll make this easy on everyone." Sarah felt anger flare in her chest, hot and clean and utterly without fear. These men thought they could take her, use her, destroy the life she had built with Ezra simply because her father had been weak and desperate. They had no idea what they were facing. "Counteroffer," Ezra called back, his voice carrying across the mountain air with military authority. "Turn around and ride away and I won't kill all of you." Harsh laughter answered his words, but Sarah noticed that none of the riders seemed eager to approach the cabin directly. Whatever reputation Ezra had built during his years in these mountains, it was clearly enough to give even hardened criminals pause. "You got maybe 10 minutes before we burn you out," the voice called again. "Save us all some trouble and make the smart choice." Morrison caught Sarah's eye and nodded toward the rifle in her hands. "You know how to use that thing. Well enough. Good, because these men don't take prisoners, and they don't leave witnesses." Sarah positioned herself at the rear window, her heart racing but her hands steady on the rifle. Through the glass she could see movement in the tree line as the Kellerman gang spread out to surround the cabin. They were professional in their approach, but so was the opposition they faced. Ezra moved to the front window, his rifle ready and his face showing the calm focus that had kept him alive through years of warfare. "Sarah," he said quietly, "whatever happens here, know that loving you has been the best thing in my life since Mary died. Tell me that again when this is over," she replied, surprised by her own steadiness. The first shot came from the tree line, splintering wood from the cabin's front wall, and announcing that negotiations were over. Ezra responded immediately, his rifle speaking with the authority of a man who had learned precision under fire. One of the Kellerman gang pitched backward from his saddle, and the others scattered for cover with the speed of men who understood they had underestimated their opposition. Sarah found herself moving with a calm she hadn't known she possessed, covering the rear approach while Morrison and Ezra handled the main assault. The skills Ezra had taught her during those quiet winter evenings came naturally now, muscle memory taking over where conscious thought might have failed her. The battle lasted 20 minutes, but felt like hours. When the shooting finally stopped, 3 of the gang members lay dead in the clearing. 2 more had fled with wounds that would slow their retreat, and Jake Morrison was pressing a bloody bandana to a graze along his ribs. "That's the end of the Kellerman operation in this territory," Morrison said, wincing as he tied off his makeshift bandage. "Word will spread that they tried to take on Ezra Kane and lost. Nobody else will be stupid enough to follow their example." Sarah lowered her rifle with hands that only now began to shake, the reality of what they had accomplished slowly settling in. On a cold frontier night in 1884, 16-year-old Sarah Miller watches her father stumble out of Murphy's saloon, his eyes glazed with whiskey and desperation. What happens next will change her life forever. In exchange for a single barrel of beer, he hands her over to Ezra Kane, a towering mountain man with weathered hands and secrets hidden behind quiet eyes. Sarah expects brutality, violence, maybe worse. Instead, she finds something she never knew existed in her harsh world: genuine kindness from a stranger who asks nothing in return. In the unforgiving wilderness of the Colorado Territory, where survival depends on strength and mercy is a luxury few can afford, an unlikely bond begins to grow between a frightened girl and the gentle giant who becomes her unlikely protector. But what dark secret from Ezra's past made him willing to pay such a price for her freedom? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The saloon doors swung shut behind them, with a finality that echoed in Sarah's chest. Her father had already disappeared back inside, probably celebrating his newfound wealth with another drink. The empty whiskey bottle that had sealed her fate lay forgotten in the dirt beside the hitching post. Ezra Kane stood beside his horse, a massive bay gelding that seemed as patient and steady as its owner. The mountain man's presence filled the space around him, not with menace as Sarah had expected, but with a curious sense of calm. He was easily 6 feet tall, with shoulders broad enough to block out the lamplight spilling from the saloon windows. His beard was neatly trimmed, streaked with early silver, despite what appeared to be no more than 35 years on his weathered face. "Miss," he said quietly, his voice carrying the rough edges of a man who spent more time talking to horses than people. "I know this ain't what you planned for tonight." Sarah's hand instinctively went to the locket at her throat, the only thing of value she owned. Her mother's locket, containing a tiny photograph and a lock of hair from a woman who had died bringing Sarah into this harsh world. The metal felt warm against her fingers, a small comfort in a moment that threatened to shatter everything she thought she knew about her life. "Are you going to hurt me?" The words came out barely above a whisper, but in the quiet of the mountain town's main street, they seemed to carry the weight of thunder. Ezra's expression softened, and for a moment, Sarah glimpsed something unexpected in his dark eyes. Pain, perhaps, or recognition of her fear that spoke to some deep understanding of what it meant to be vulnerable in an unforgiving world. "No, miss. I give you my word on that." He reached into his coat and withdrew a thick woolen cloak, holding it out to her with hands that, despite their size and obvious strength, moved with surprising gentleness. "Night's getting cold. We've got some traveling ahead of us." Sarah stared at the offered cloak, her mind racing through possibilities, none of them particularly encouraging. She could run, but where would she go? Her father had made it clear she was no longer welcome in his life, if she ever truly had been. The town held nothing for her. No relatives or friends who would take in a 16-year-old girl with no money and no prospects. "Where are we going?" she asked, accepting the cloak and wrapping it around her shoulders. The wool was soft and well cared for, smelling faintly of pine and wood smoke. "My place up in the mountains. It's a fair ride, but we'll take it easy." Ezra moved to help her onto his horse, his touch careful and respectful. "You ever ridden before?" Sarah had ridden the family's old plow horse occasionally, though calling those brief childhood adventures riding was perhaps generous. This horse was different, powerful and alert, responding to Ezra's quiet commands with an intelligence that spoke of years of partnership. As they rode through the town's sleeping streets, Sarah found herself studying her unlikely companion. He rode with the easy confidence of someone born to the saddle, but there was something else in his bearing, a carefulness, as if he was constantly aware of her presence behind him and determined to ensure her comfort and safety. The town fell away behind them as they followed a winding trail up into the foothills. The night air grew crisper with each mile, carrying scents Sarah had never experienced: pine trees, snow from distant peaks, and something clean and wild that made her lungs feel clearer than they had in years. Why? The question escaped before she could stop it. Ezra slowed the horse, turning slightly in the saddle to glance back at her. "Why? What, miss? Why did you pay for me? What do you want?" The mountain man was quiet for so long that Sarah began to wonder if he had heard her question. When he finally spoke, his words carried a weight that suggested they cost him something to say. "Your daddy owed some bad men money, real bad men. They were planning to take you as payment anyway, and what they had in mind wouldn't have been kind." He paused, his hands steady on the reins, even as his voice roughened with emotion. "I figured you deserved better than that." Sarah felt tears she hadn't expected burning behind her eyes. Not tears of fear or despair, but something else entirely, something that felt dangerously close to hope. The stars above the Colorado Territory burned with a brilliance Sarah had never witnessed from the smoky confines of town. Away from the oil lamps and coal fires, the night sky revealed itself in all its ancient glory, a canopy of silver light that made her feel both infinitely small and somehow connected to something far greater than her own small troubles. Ezra had chosen their camping spot with obvious care, a small clearing beside a creek where the sound of running water would mask any noise they might make. He moved around the camp with practiced efficiency, gathering deadfall for a fire and arranging stones in a careful circle. Every action seemed deliberate, purposeful, the behavior of a man who had spent considerable time alone in the wilderness. "Cold out here," he said, noticing Sarah's shiver, despite the thick cloak. "Fire'll warm you up soon enough." Sarah watched as he coaxed flames from tinder and kindling, his hands sure and steady despite the mountain chill. When the fire caught and began to throw dancing shadows across the surrounding pine trees, he reached into his pack and withdrew a heavy wool blanket, dark blue with faded military markings still visible along one edge. "Here," he said, shaking out the blanket and offering it to her. "Wrap up good. Temperature drops fast once the sun goes down in these mountains." The blanket carried the same wood smoke scent as his cloak, but underneath it Sarah detected something else. Leather and gun oil, perhaps, or the indefinable smell of a man who had seen more of the world than most. She wrapped herself in its warmth and settled on a fallen log Ezra had positioned near the fire. "Were you a soldier?" she asked, noting the military markings and the way he carried himself, straight-backed and alert even in this peaceful setting. Ezra's hands stilled for a moment as he arranged their simple supper. For a time, his voice carried a note that suggested the subject was not one he visited willingly. Long time ago now, he had produced bread and dried meat from his pack, along with a small pot for brewing coffee. The meal was simple but prepared with the same careful attention he seemed to give everything else. Sarah found herself hungrier than she had expected, the mountain air and the day's shock having worked up an appetite she hadn't noticed until food appeared before her. "This is good," she said, surprised by the quality of the simple fare. "A man learns to take care of himself up in the mountains, no choice in the matter." Ezra poured coffee into a tin cup and handed it to her, the metal warm against her cold fingers. "You warm enough?" Sarah nodded, though she noticed he had given her the only cup and was drinking his coffee directly from the pot. Everything about his behavior spoke of someone accustomed to putting others' comfort before his own, a courtesy that sat strangely with her expectations of what this night might bring. "Are you going to tell me what you want from me?" The question came out more boldly than she had intended, fueled perhaps by the coffee and the growing warmth of the fire. Ezra looked up from his own portion of bread and meat, his dark eyes reflecting the firelight. "I want you to be safe, that's all. Men don't spend money on safety for strangers, not without wanting something in return." The mountain man was quiet for a long moment, staring into the flames as if they might hold answers to questions he hadn't yet learned to ask. "Maybe not most men," he said finally, "but I ain't most men." Sarah studied his profile in the flickering light, noting the way his jaw tensed when he spoke about himself, as if the words cost him something. "What happened to you? What do you mean? Something happened to make you different, to make you the kind of man who pays for a stranger's safety." Ezra's laugh held no humor. "You're a perceptive one. I'll give you that. He took a long drink from the coffee pot, then set it aside. Lost someone once, someone who needed protecting and didn't get it when it mattered. The words hung in the mountain air like smoke from their fire, carrying weight that Sarah could feel even if she couldn't fully understand it. She pulled the military blanket tighter around her shoulders and studied this puzzling man who had stepped into her life at its darkest moment. "I'm sorry," she said softly. "Not your fault, just life being what it is." Ezra stood and began banking the fire for the night. "You should get some rest. We've got ground to cover tomorrow." The trail wound higher into the mountains as the morning sun climbed toward its peak, casting long shadows through stands of pine and aspen that rustled with the whisper of early autumn. Sarah had never been this high above the world, where the air grew thin and crystalline, each breath feeling sharper and cleaner than anything she had known in the dusty confines of town. After 3 hours of steady climbing, Ezra guided the horse around a bend in the trail, and Sarah saw their destination. Nestled in a natural clearing surrounded by towering evergreens sat a log cabin that seemed to grow from the landscape itself. The structure was solid and well maintained, with a stone chimney that promised warmth and a wide front porch that spoke of quiet evenings watching the sun set over distant peaks. "This is home," Ezra said simply, dismounting and reaching up to help Sarah down from the horse. Sarah's legs felt unsteady after the long ride, but her attention was captured by the details that revealed themselves as they approached the cabin. Windows fitted with real glass, not the oiled paper she had known all her life. A carefully tended garden plot showing the remnants of a summer's vegetables. Firewood stacked with military precision along the cabin's north wall. Ezra led his horse to a small stable behind the cabin, speaking to the animal in the same gentle tones he used with Sarah. She followed, noting the way everything seemed to have its place, maintained with a care that spoke of pride in ownership and respect for the tools of survival. "Come on inside," he said, shouldering his pack and gesturing toward the cabin's front door. "I'll get a fire going and you can see what you think of the place." The interior of the cabin exceeded Sarah's wildest expectations. The main room was spacious and warm, dominated by a stone fireplace that could easily accommodate logs 3 feet long. Hand-hewn furniture filled the space with simple elegance. A table and chairs that showed the marks of careful craftsmanship, shelves lined with more books than Sarah had ever seen in one place, and rugs that added color and comfort to the polished plank floors. But it was the wooden cross mounted above the fireplace that caught and held her attention. Carved from what appeared to be a single piece of dark wood, the cross was simple yet beautiful, its surface polished smooth by years of careful tending. No decoration adorned it, no elaborate carving or inlay, just the clean lines of faith rendered in honest craftsmanship. "Did you make that?" Sarah asked, nodding toward the cross. Ezra followed her gaze and nodded. "Carved it from a piece of oak that came down in a storm my first winter here." Seemed like the wood wanted to be something meaningful. He moved to the fireplace and began arranging kindling with the same methodical care he applied to everything else. "My ma would have been pleased to see it there." The fire caught quickly, filling the room with warmth and the comforting scent of burning pine. Sarah moved closer to the flames, extending her hands toward the heat, while her eyes continued to explore her new surroundings. "Those are a lot of books," she observed, noting the titles that ranged from practical guides to farming and carpentry, to volumes of poetry and philosophy. A man needs something to occupy his mind during the long winters. Books don't judge you for your past mistakes, and they're always willing to share what they know. Ezra straightened from the fireplace and brushed ash from his hands. "You're welcome to read any of them that interest you." Sarah moved to the nearest shelf, running her fingers along the spines of books she had only dreamed of owning. "I can read," she said, a note of pride creeping into her voice. "My mother taught me before she died. That's a gift worth having. Education's one thing nobody can take away from you. No matter what else happens in life." The cabin felt like stepping into a different world, one where beauty and learning were valued alongside the practical necessities of survival. Sarah found herself beginning to relax for the first time since her father had stumbled out of Murphy's saloon, the tension in her shoulders easing as the warmth of the fire and the evident care Ezra had put into creating this home worked their quiet magic. "There's a room for you," Ezra said, gesturing toward a door at the back of the cabin. Small, but it's got a good window and a comfortable bed. Privacy when you need it. The offer of privacy struck Sarah as significant in ways she was only beginning to understand. The small room Ezra had given her was more than Sarah had ever dared hope for. A real bed with a thick mattress and warm quilts, a window that looked out over the valley below, and a chest of drawers that spoke of permanence and belonging. But it was what she found in those drawers that made her heart race with questions she wasn't sure she was ready to ask. Women's clothing, not the rough, practical garments Sarah was accustomed to, but dresses made of soft cotton and wool, chemises edged with delicate lace, and stockings that had never known a single mend. The clothes fit her as if they had been made for her body, though she could tell from their style and the faint scent of lavender that clung to them that they had belonged to someone else. Sarah lifted a blue dress from the drawer, holding it up to the window light. The fabric was beautiful, well cared for, and sized for a woman of her exact proportions. The realization sent a chill through her that had nothing to do with the mountain air. "Miss Sarah?" Ezra's voice came from the main room, carefully respectful of her privacy. "I got some hot water if you'd like to wash up. Been a long journey." Sarah set the dress carefully back in the drawer and made her way to the main room, where Ezra was transferring heated water from a large pot to a wash basin he had placed on a small table near the fire. "The clothes in the room," she said, without preamble. "Whose were they?" Ezra's hands stilled on the pot handle, and for a moment Sarah thought he might not answer. When he finally spoke, his voice carried a weight of grief that made her regret the directness of her question. "They belong to my wife, Mary." He set the pot down carefully and turned to face her, his expression open but pained. "She passed 3 years ago this winter. Fever took her, and there wasn't anything I could do to stop it." The simple words hit Sarah like a physical blow. She had been wondering about his motivations, suspicious of his kindness, and all the while he had been a widower, still carrying the weight of his loss. "I'm sorry," she said softly. "I shouldn't have asked. You had a right to know." Living in another woman's clothes, sleeping in her bed. Ezra picked up a clean towel and placed it beside the wash basin. Mary would have wanted them used. She never could stand to see things go to waste, especially things that might bring comfort to someone who needed it. Sarah moved closer to the fire, drawn by both its warmth and the need to see Ezra's face more clearly. What was she like? A small smile touched the corners of Ezra's mouth, the first genuine expression of happiness Sarah had seen from him. She was good, really good, in the way that some people are good all the way through to their bones. Saw the best in everyone, even when they couldn't see it in themselves. "Is that why you helped me? Because she would have wanted you to?" Ezra considered the question, his gaze fixed on the flames dancing in the fireplace. "Maybe, but I think I would have helped you anyway. Some things are just right to do, regardless of what anyone else might want." Sarah found herself studying this man, who had turned her world upside down with an act of unexpected mercy. Everything about him spoke of loneliness carefully managed, grief transformed into purpose, and a gentleness that seemed to come from the deepest part of his character. "Will you tell me about her?" Sarah asked, settling into one of the chairs beside the fire. "She loved this place," Ezra began, his voice taking on a storytelling cadence that suggested he had shared these memories before, perhaps with the mountain silence as his only audience. "Came up here as a new bride, city-born and raised, and fell in love with the wilderness like she was born to it. Had a way with growing things that bordered on magical." He gestured toward the window that looked out over the garden plot Sarah had noticed earlier. That garden was her pride and joy. Coaxed vegetables out of mountain soil that had no business supporting anything but pine trees. Said the secret was talking to the plants like they were people, treating them with respect and patience. "She sounds wonderful." "She was."
"And she would have liked you."
Ezra stood and moved toward the door. "I'll leave you to wash up and get settled. There's venison stew keeping warm on the stove for when you're ready to eat." The morning air carried the bite of approaching winter as Sarah stepped out onto the cabin's front porch, wrapping Mary's woolen shawl around her shoulders. 3 weeks had passed since her arrival, and she had begun to understand the rhythm of mountain life, the careful preparation, the respect for nature's timing, and the absolute necessity of being ready for whatever the harsh season might bring. Ezra was already at work in the garden, pulling the last of the root vegetables before the ground froze solid. His movements were efficient and purposeful, each action guided by years of experience and the knowledge that winter in the high country was an unforgiving teacher that rarely offered second chances. "Morning," he called, looking up from a row of turnips. "Sleep well?" "Better than I have in years," Sarah replied truthfully. The mountain silence had taken some getting used to, but now she found the absence of town noise soothing, rather than unsettling. She joined him among the vegetable rows, kneeling to help gather the harvest. Her hands had grown stronger during her time here, calloused from helping with daily chores and no longer soft with the helplessness of a girl who had never been expected to contribute to her own survival. "What's this?" she asked, picking up a small leather-bound book that had been resting on a wooden crate beside the garden. The cover was worn smooth by handling, and when she opened it, she found pages covered with neat handwriting in faded ink. "Mary's recipe book," Ezra said softly, pausing in his work to glance at the book in Sarah's hands. She wrote down everything she learned about preserving food, cooking for the mountains, making do with what we could grow or hunt. Sarah turned the pages carefully, reading notes written in a feminine hand that spoke of patience and creativity. Instructions for smoking meat, recipes for bread that would last through long winters, techniques for preserving vegetables without the benefit of a proper root cellar. She drew pictures too, Sarah observed, noting the small sketches that accompanied many of the recipes. Detailed drawings of herbs and their uses, illustrations of proper techniques for preparing game, careful diagrams showing the best methods for storing various foods. She said cooking was like any other skill worth doing right, worth preserving for the future. Ezra's voice carried the warmth that always entered it when he spoke of his wife. Said maybe someday someone else would need to know how to make a proper meal out of mountain ingredients. Sarah found herself absorbed in the book's contents, each page revealing new aspects of Mary's character. The woman had been practical yet imaginative, careful yet willing to experiment. Notes in the margins spoke of failures as well as successes, adjustments made year after year as she learned to work with the mountain's challenges rather than against them. "This one looks complicated," Sarah said, stopping at a recipe for preserved vegetables that involved multiple steps and precise timing. Mary's winter vegetable medley kept us fed through some lean months when the snows came early and stayed late. Ezra moved to look over Sarah's shoulder, and she caught the scent of wood smoke and honest work that she had come to associate with his presence. "She tried to teach me that one 3 different times before I got it right. Could you teach me?" The question surprised them both. Sarah hadn't planned to ask, but looking at Mary's careful notes and Ezra's obvious knowledge, she found herself genuinely wanting to learn these skills that could mean the difference between comfort and hardship during the long winter ahead. "You sure you want to tackle that one? It's a fair bit of work, and we'd need to start today if we're going to get the vegetables ready before they spoil." "I'm sure." Sarah closed the book carefully, holding it against her chest like the treasure it clearly was. "Mary put all this knowledge in here for a reason. It seems wrong to let it go unused." Ezra smiled, the expression transforming his usually serious face into something younger and more hopeful. She would have liked that, always said knowledge was meant to be shared, not hoarded. They worked together through the morning, following Mary's detailed instructions as they prepared vegetables for the preservation process. Sarah found herself thinking about the woman who had created these recipes, imagining her working in this same garden, learning through trial and error how to thrive in this beautiful but demanding place. "Ezra," she said as they worked, "thank you for all of this." "Thank you for what?" "For letting me be part of it, for treating me like I belong here." The storm struck 3 days into November with the fury of a living thing determined to test every preparation Ezra had made over the years. Snow fell so thick and fast that the world beyond the cabin windows disappeared into a white void, while wind howled around the sturdy log walls with voices that seemed almost human in their intensity. Sarah had never experienced weather like this. In town, winter meant cold and discomfort, but here in the mountains, it meant isolation so complete that the outside world might as well have ceased to exist. The storm had been raging for 2 days now, and Ezra had assured her it could continue for several more. "Good thing we got that preserving done when we did," he said, stoking the fire that had become the center of their confined world. "Storm like this would have caught us short if we'd waited." Sarah pulled Mary's quilt tighter around her shoulders and nodded toward the heavy wooden door that led to what Ezra called the root cellar. Built into the hillside behind the cabin, the underground room housed their winter supplies: preserved vegetables, smoked meat, sacks of flour and beans, and dozens of other provisions that Ezra had spent years accumulating. "How long could we survive if we had to?" she asked, the question prompted not by fear, but by genuine curiosity about the careful planning that had gone into their sanctuary. "If we're careful, 3 months, maybe 4. Ezra settled into the chair across from her, holding a cup of coffee that steamed in the firelight. "That cache back there represents a lot of years of preparation. Some folks think mountain living is about being tough enough to handle whatever comes. Truth is, it's about being smart enough to plan for it." The emergency supply cache had impressed Sarah from the moment Ezra first showed it to her. Rows of shelves lined the walls, each one carefully organized and labeled in Ezra's neat handwriting. Canned goods, dried fruits, medical supplies, candles, matches, and a dozen other necessities, arranged with military precision. "You really think this storm could last that long?" "Not likely, but possible. Weather up here doesn't follow town rules. Best to be ready for anything." The wind chose that moment to slam against the cabin with particular violence, causing the flames in the fireplace to dance and flicker. Sarah found herself grateful for the solid construction and careful maintenance that made their shelter feel secure even in the face of nature's assault. "Tell me about your first winter here," she said, settling deeper into her chair. The enforced intimacy of the storm had made conversation easier between them, and she had discovered that Ezra was a natural storyteller when the mood struck him. "First winter nearly killed me," he admitted with a rueful smile. "Thought I knew what I was doing, being a soldier and all. Turns out fighting other men and fighting the mountains are 2 entirely different kinds of warfare." "What happened?" "Ran out of firewood in January. Had to burn furniture to keep from freezing. Then spent 3 weeks chopping wood in weather so cold my breath froze before it left my mouth." Ezra's eyes held the distant look that meant he was remembering something both painful and important. "Mary found me that spring, half dead from exhaustion and stupidity. Nursed me back to health and taught me how to live up here instead of just surviving." Sarah could picture it. Ezra, younger and less wise, struggling against forces he didn't yet understand, and Mary, patient and knowledgeable, teaching him the lessons that had ultimately created this sanctuary where they now sat in warmth and safety. "She saved you, in more ways than one." Ezra stared into the fire for a long moment. "I came up here angry and hurting, thinking I wanted to be alone forever. She showed me the difference between choosing solitude and having it forced on you." The storm continued its assault on the cabin, but inside their circle of firelight, Sarah felt a peace she had never known. The warmth, the security, the quiet companionship of someone who asked nothing from her but her presence, it was more than she had ever dared hope for. "I'm not afraid," she said suddenly, surprised by the realization. "Of the storm, of anything. For the first time in my life, I'm not afraid of what tomorrow might bring." Ezra looked at her across the firelight, and something in his expression made her breath catch. "Neither am I," he said quietly. The storm had passed, leaving behind a world transformed by 3 feet of pristine snow that sparkled like scattered diamonds in the morning sun. Sarah was helping Ezra clear a path to the stable when she noticed him wince as he lifted a particularly heavy shovelful of snow. "Your shoulder's bothering you again," she observed, noting the way he favored his left side when he thought she wasn't watching. Ezra paused in his shoveling, straightening slowly. "Old injury, acts up when the weather changes." She had fired 12 shots during the battle, and Ezra's quiet nod of approval told her that her aim had been true when it mattered most. "Is it over?" she asked, not daring to hope that their troubles could end so simply. "This part is," Ezra replied, but his attention was focused on something else. The sound of approaching horses came again from the mountain trail, but this time the rhythm was different, measured, organized and accompanied by voices calling out in greeting rather than threat. "That'll be the neighbors," Morrison said with something approaching a smile. "Word travels fast in the mountains when there's shooting to be heard." Within minutes, the clearing around the cabin filled with riders from the scattered homesteads that dotted the surrounding valleys. Fred Kowalski from the next ridge over, the Santos family from their ranch 5 miles south, and nearly a dozen other mountain families who had heard the gunfire and come to help. "Ezra," called out Tom Santos, dismounting quickly and surveying the scene with experienced eyes. "You folks all right?" "We're fine, Tom. Kellerman gang thought they could cause trouble up here." An older woman Sarah had never met approached the cabin, carrying a cloth bag that clearly contained medical supplies. "I'm Mrs. Henderson," she said to Sarah with a warm smile. "Heard you might need some doctoring up here." As the mountain community gathered around the cabin, Sarah began to understand something that hadn't been clear before. These people weren't just neighbors, they were family in the way that isolation creates family, bound together by shared challenges and mutual dependence. "We brought something for you, Ezra," Tom Santos said, reaching into his saddlebag and withdrawing a folded document covered with signatures. "Been working on this since word got around about your trouble with the army." Sarah watched as Ezra unfolded the paper, his eyes widening as he read the carefully written text. It was a petition, she realized, signed by every family within 50 miles of the cabin. The document testified to Ezra's character, his service to the community, and his value as a neighbor and protector. "Mrs. Chen wrote it out proper," Tom explained. "Used to be a school teacher before she married and moved out here. She's got a way with formal language." Sarah read over Ezra's shoulder, seeing story after story of help given during harsh winters, medical care provided during emergencies, and protection offered to families threatened by the kind of predators they had just defeated. "Every family here has a reason to be grateful to you," Miss Henderson added. "When Jake Morrison started asking questions in town, we decided it was time to make that gratitude official." Morrison stepped forward, his expression thoughtful as he studied the petition and the faces of the people who had signed it. "This carries weight," he said finally. "Character witnesses from an entire community, especially frontier folk who don't give their respect lightly. Will it be enough?" Sarah asked. "Combined with my brother's letter and the evidence about the Kellerman operation?" Morrison nodded slowly. "I think it will be. Military tribunals pay attention to community standing, especially when that community includes veterans who served with distinction." Sarah felt tears threatening as she looked around at the faces of people who had risked their safety to support the man who had become her anchor in a dangerous world. The journey to Denver took 3 days, with Sarah riding alongside Ezra and Morrison as they descended from the high country toward the sprawling frontier city that served as the territorial capital. Sarah had never seen so many buildings in one place, or so many people moving with the purposeful energy of commerce and government. The military tribunal convened in a stone building that spoke of federal authority and bureaucratic permanence. Sarah found herself sitting in a wooden chair that felt hard and unforgiving, watching as uniformed officers reviewed the evidence that would determine whether Ezra faced prison or freedom. Colonel Marcus Webb, the tribunal's senior officer, was a man whose bearing suggested decades of military service and the kind of experience that didn't suffer fools or lies. He examined each document with careful attention, occasionally asking questions that demonstrated his understanding of both military procedure and frontier reality. "This is quite a collection of evidence, Mr. Kane," Colonel Webb said, holding up the letter from Lieutenant Colonel Morris. "Your former commander, Captain Hartley, filed a very different account of the events at Second Bull Run." "Captain Hartley wasn't on the field when the action took place, sir," Ezra replied, his military bearing evident even in civilian clothes. "He remained at the command post, while his men carried out what he believed were his orders." And you're saying you disobeyed those orders? I'm saying I interpreted them in a way that kept 37 Union soldiers alive, sir. My understanding was that the mission objective was to neutralize the Confederate position, not to sacrifice men unnecessarily. Colonel Webb turned to another document, one that Sarah hadn't seen before. The paper bore official seals and multiple signatures, suggesting it carried significant weight within military circles. We've also received this commendation letter from General Grant's staff. The colonel continued, detailing your actions during the siege of Vicksburg. It seems your tactical innovations saved considerable lives during that campaign as well. Sarah felt her heart race as she realized they had additional evidence she hadn't known about. Morrison caught her eye and nodded slightly, indicating that he had been working behind the scenes to gather support for Ezra's case. The pattern suggests a soldier who consistently placed the welfare of his men above strict adherence to questionable orders, Colonel Webb observed. While such behavior can be problematic in terms of chain of command, it's also the mark of a leader who understands the difference between following orders and following conscience. The tribunal members conferred quietly among themselves, while Sarah waited in an agony of suspense. Everything she and Ezra had built together hung in the balance of their decision, and she found herself praying to whatever powers might be listening that justice would prevail over bureaucracy. There's also the matter of your community standing, Colonel Webb said, returning his attention to Ezra. This petition from your neighbors presents a compelling picture of a man who has contributed significantly to the safety and welfare of frontier settlement. Those people risk their lives just by living where they do, sir, Ezra replied. They deserve protection from the kind of predators who see isolation as opportunity. Sarah thought about the families who had signed that petition, each name representing someone who had been helped by Ezra's quiet strength and unwavering decency. Fred Kowalski, whose nightmares from the war had been eased by Ezra's patient understanding. The Santos family, whose ranch had been defended against cattle thieves by Ezra's tactical expertise. The tribunal finds, Colonel Webb announced after what seemed like an eternity of deliberation, that the charges against Sergeant Ezra Kane are not supported by credible evidence. The official record will be amended to reflect that Sergeant Kane acted with distinction during the engagement at Second Bull Run, saving lives through tactical innovation and personal courage. Sarah felt tears of relief stream down her face as the words registered. Not only was Ezra cleared of the desertion charges, but his actions were being officially recognized as heroic rather than insubordinate. Furthermore, Colonel Webb continued, this tribunal recommends that Sergeant Kane be awarded the Distinguished Service Cross for his actions at both Second Bull Run and Vicksburg, recognizing a pattern of exceptional leadership under fire. Morrison stood and extended his hand to Ezra, his expression mixing relief with genuine respect. My brother would have been proud to see this day, he said simply. Sarah watched as Ezra shook Morrison's hand, seeing the burden of false accusation finally lifted from his shoulders after years of carrying it alone. They returned to the mountain cabin as the aspen trees were turning gold with the first touch of autumn, their leaves catching the late afternoon sunlight like scattered coins. Sarah had never seen the place look more beautiful or felt more grateful to call somewhere home. The journey to Denver had cleared Ezra's name, but more importantly, it had confirmed what her heart had known for months. This mountain sanctuary was where she belonged. That evening, as they sat on the front porch watching the sun set over the distant peaks, Ezra reached into his pocket and withdrew something small and carefully wrapped in soft cloth. Sarah's breath caught as he unwrapped a simple gold ring, clearly handmade with the same patient craftsmanship he brought to everything he touched. I carved this from a nugget Tom Santos found in his creek last spring, Ezra said, his voice carrying the nervous uncertainty of a man stepping into unfamiliar territory. Took me 3 months to get it right, working on it in the evenings when you were reading by the fire. Sarah stared at the ring, seeing not just the gold but the hours of careful work, the hope and love that had gone into its creation. The band was smooth and warm, sized perfectly for her finger, though she had never seen him measure it. Sarah Miller, Ezra continued, sliding from his chair to kneel beside hers, would you do me the honor of becoming my wife? The words she had dreamed of hearing but never quite dared to hope for hung in the mountain air between them. Sarah looked down at this man who had saved her from despair, protected her from danger, and shown her what it meant to be cherished for exactly who she was. "Yes," she whispered, then louder, with a joy that seemed to echo off the surrounding peaks. "Yes, Ezra Kane, I will marry you." She slipped the ring onto her finger with hands that trembled slightly, and Sarah marveled at how perfectly it fit, as if it had been waiting for her all along. The gold caught the last rays of sunlight, throwing tiny sparkles of light that seemed to dance with the same happiness that filled her heart. "I know this isn't the life you were born to," Ezra said, settling back into his chair, but keeping hold of her hand. "Dad, help here, isolated, and there's always the chance of trouble from weather or worse. This is exactly the life I was born to," Sarah replied, intertwining their fingers so the ring pressed warm against both their skin. "I just had to find my way to—" They spent the evening making plans for their future together, talking about the practical details of a frontier wedding and the deeper questions of what kind of life they wanted to build. Sarah found herself thinking about Mary's flower garden, now blooming with the full glory of late summer, and how she would tend it as her own, while honoring the woman who had planted its foundation. "We could have the ceremony here," she suggested, "in the garden with all the neighbors who signed the petition. Make it a celebration of community as well as love." Ezra's smile was brighter than she had ever seen it. Mary would have loved that idea. She always said the best celebrations were the ones that brought people together. As the stars emerged overhead, Sarah found herself reflecting on the strange journey that had brought her to this moment. Her father's drunken desperation, which had seemed like the worst betrayal imaginable, had actually led her to the greatest happiness she had ever known. Sometimes she realized the most terrible things could become doorways to the most beautiful ones. "Do you ever wonder what would have happened if Morrison had taken you that first day?" she asked, curious about the paths not taken. "Every day," Ezra admitted. "But then I remember that we're here now, together, and that's what matters. The past brought us to each other, but the future is ours to make." Sarah leaned against his shoulder, feeling the solid strength that had become her anchor in an uncertain world. The ring on her finger caught starlight now, instead of sunlight, but it sparkled just as brightly, a symbol of promises made and love freely given. "What do you think our children will think of this place?" She's surprising herself with the question. "I think they'll understand that love can grow anywhere, as long as it's tended with patience and care," Ezra replied, pressing a kiss to the top of her head, just like Mary's flowers. The wedding took place on a crisp October morning, when the mountain air sparkled with the promise of winter's approach, and Mary's flower garden displayed its final burst of autumn color. Nearly 30 neighbors had made the journey to the cabin, creating a celebration that filled the clearing with laughter, music, and the kind of joy that comes from witnessing love triumph over adversity. Sarah wore Mary's white dress, carefully altered to fit her smaller frame, with a crown of late-blooming cosmos from the garden she had planted with such hope months earlier. Ezra stood beneath an arch of pine boughs that Tom Santos and his sons had constructed, looking handsome and somewhat overwhelmed in his best suit, freshly pressed for the occasion. Jake Morrison served as Ezra's best man, a development that would have seemed impossible just weeks earlier. The bounty hunter had proven himself during the confrontation with the Kellerman gang, and his testimony to the military tribunal had been instrumental in clearing Ezra's name. Now he stood beside the man he had once hunted, testament to the way truth can transform the most unlikely relationships. Mrs. Henderson had volunteered to officiate the ceremony, having served as a justice of the peace in her younger days before moving to the mountains. Her voice carried clearly across the gathering as she spoke about the courage required to choose love in a world that often seemed determined to tear people apart. "Sarah and Ezra," she said, "you've both learned that life doesn't always follow the paths we expect. You've discovered that sometimes the worst things that happen to us can lead to the best things if we have the wisdom to recognize them and the courage to embrace them." Sarah felt tears threatening as she looked around at the faces surrounding them. These people had become her family in ways her birth family had never managed. Fred Kowalski, who had taught her to recognize the signs of approaching weather, the Santos family, whose children had shown her what it meant to be accepted without question, Miss Chen, whose quiet wisdom had helped her understand the difference between surviving and thriving. When it came time for the exchange of rings, Ezra produced a second ring that matched the one he had given her, simple gold, that spoke of permanence and commitment without ostentation. Sarah slipped it onto his finger with hands that barely trembled, amazed at how right this moment felt, after a lifetime of uncertainty. "You may kiss your bride," Mrs. Henderson announced, and the gathered crowd erupted in cheers and applause that echoed off the surrounding mountains. Later, as the celebration continued with a feast prepared by the entire community, Sarah found herself standing alone for a moment beside Mary's garden. The flowers were beginning to fade with the season, but their beauty remained, a legacy of hope, planted by a woman who had believed in tomorrow even when her own tomorrows were numbered. "She would have loved this," Ezra said, joining her among the fading blooms. "I hope she knows," Sarah replied. "I hope she knows that her garden helped teach me how to love this place, and you." Ezra pulled an envelope from his jacket pocket, handling it with the careful reverence he reserved for things that mattered deeply. "I wrote this last night," he said. "For your father, thought you might want to send it. Let him know how things turned out." Sarah took the envelope, noting her father's name written in Ezra's careful script. The letter inside, she knew, would tell the story of her new life, her marriage and her happiness, not with bitterness or recrimination, but with the kind of gentle honesty that had become characteristic of the man she had married. "Will you read it first?" she asked. "Already did. Wanted to make sure it said what you would want it to say." Sarah opened the envelope and read the letter, finding words that spoke of forgiveness without pretending the past hadn't happened, of gratitude for a journey that had led to unexpected joy, and of a daughter who had found her way to a life worth living. "It's perfect," she said, folding the letter carefully and placing it back in the envelope. "He should know that his desperation led to my salvation. Maybe that will help him find some peace." As the sun set over their wedding celebration, Sarah found herself thinking about the strange mathematics of providence. Her father's betrayal plus Ezra's kindness had somehow equaled love. Loss plus courage had become hope. And two broken people had discovered that they could create something whole and beautiful together. 1 year later, Sarah stood in the doorway of the cabin watching the first snow of winter dust the mountain peaks, her hand resting on the gentle curve of her belly where their child grew beneath her heart. The baby was due in spring, timed perfectly to arrive with the season of new beginnings and Mary's flowers blooming again in the garden that had become Sarah's pride and joy. Ezra was at the kitchen table, carefully entering their wedding certificate into the family Bible that had belonged to his grandmother, his movements deliberate and reverent as he recorded this latest chapter in the Kane family history. The leather-bound book already contained decades of birth, death, marriages, and other milestones that marked the passage of generations. "There," he said, setting down his pen and blowing gently on the fresh ink. "Sarah Elizabeth Miller Kane, married October 15th, 1885. Now it's official in the eyes of God and family history." Sarah moved to look over his shoulder, reading the careful script that transformed her from a girl with no real family into a woman with roots that stretched back through generations of people who had faced hardship with courage and built lives of meaning from whatever materials they could find. "Your grandmother would have liked that," she said, noting the way Ezra's handwriting echoed the careful style of earlier entries in the Bible. "She would have liked you," Ezra replied, closing the book carefully and placing it back in its honored position on the mantelpiece. "Always said the best marriages were the ones where two people helped each other become better than they could be alone." Sarah settled into her chair by the fire, grateful for the warmth and the peaceful domesticity that had become the foundation of her days. Outside, the wind was picking up, carrying the promise of a long winter ahead, but inside their sanctuary, she felt nothing but contentment and anticipation for the future they were building together. "Do you think our child will understand?" she asked, a question that had been growing in her mind as her pregnancy progressed. "About how we came to be together?" Ezra considered the question seriously, as he considered all her thoughts and concerns. I think they'll understand that love can come from the strangest places, and that sometimes what looks like the worst thing that could happen is actually the beginning of the best thing. A knock at the door interrupted their quiet evening, unusual enough in winter weather to make them both alert. Ezra opened the door to reveal a figure Sarah hadn't expected to see again, her father, looking older and more weathered than she remembered, holding his hat in hands that shook slightly from more than just the cold. "Sarah," he said simply, his voice carrying a weight of regret and hope that made her chest tighten with unexpected emotion. She rose slowly, studying the man who had shaped her early life in ways both painful and ultimately redemptive. "Father, I got your letter," he continued, glancing at Ezra with a mixture of gratitude and shame. "Took me a year to work up the courage to come see if what you wrote was true." Sarah could see that her father was struggling with something deeper than just the difficulty of mountain travel in winter. His face carried the marks of a man who had wrestled with his conscience and found it wanting, but who had finally chosen to face the consequences of his actions. "It's true," she said simply. "All of it." Her father's eyes filled with tears as he looked around the warm, comfortable cabin, taking in the evidence of the life his daughter had built from the ashes of his betrayal. "I came to ask your forgiveness," he said finally, "and to thank the man who saved my daughter when I failed her." Ezra stepped forward, extending his hand to the older man. "You're welcome here," he said simply. "Sarah's family is my family." Sarah felt the last pieces of her old pain dissolving as she watched her father accept Ezra's offer of hospitality. The circle was complete now. The betrayal that had seemed so devastating had led to love. The abandonment had become rescue, and the family that had been broken was being remade into something stronger and more beautiful. "Stay for the winter," she heard herself saying. "Stay and meet your grandchild when spring comes." As her father nodded, overcome with emotion, Sarah placed her hand on the Bible, where their wedding was recorded, and thought about the legacy they were creating. Their child would grow up knowing that love could triumph over betrayal, that gentleness was stronger than force, and that sometimes the darkest moments could become doorways to the brightest light.